Welcome back to my History of Tarot series. My name is Becca, and if you haven't watched part 1 about the minor arcana, I recommend that you do that now. But if you don't, here's a brief recap. Playing cards were invented in China about 1,000 years ago based on their currency. The cards then moved into the Islamic world and were refined into suits that were more recognizable to us today, similar to tarot suits around 1200. In the late 1300s, they moved into Europe and were refined into the rods, cups, coins, and swords that we use today in Spain and Italy. In the 1400s, the suits moved into Germany and France and were changed to the more common playing card suits of spades, diamonds, hearts, and clubs that we know today. But the original suits remained popular in Italy, which is where we come in with the major arcana. And I forgot to say this in my previous video about the minor arcana, but arcana means secret in Latin. So we have the minor arcana, the small secrets, and the major arcana, the big secrets. And so it's a very tarot specific term, and I didn't mention it. We use this term and so many people don't know what it means or where it comes from, but arcana means secret. And it really refers to the divination aspect of tarot. What I'm talking about here in this video, I'm talking about the 1500s, people weren't using arcana to describe the cards. That's a very recent tarot convention since probably the late 1700s, but more on that in part 3 when we get into the divinatory aspects of tarot. But right now we're talking about really how the trumps were created. So you've probably heard the term playing the trump card. And, this means to get the best of a situation. Well, it comes from what's called trick playing card games. A modern one that was still played is bridge, where one suit is the best suit to play, and that suit beats the others. Well, in the 1400s, people were playing these card games, and they thought that it would be fun. It would be an interesting innovation if instead of just having these 4 suits that you picked one to be the highest card, to have a whole 5th suit that was all trump cards that would always be the winning cards. And that's how the tarot major arcana came into existence, as winning cards for the specific game that was being played in Italy. And at the time, these were called triomphi cards, which translates into triumph or trump in English. There is one theory that the trumps also came from China, like the other 4 suits did, but from a different game, and these 2 games are sort of slammed together to make the tarot decks. But this is there's not a lot of evidence for this, and I think it's really more of a coincidence of correspondence rather than an actual correlation between them, because basically the idea is that there's 22 cards in the majors, and when you roll 2 pairs of 6-sided dice, the total number of combinations you can have is 21. So the 21 numbered cards plus the 0 for the Fool. And there was a domino-based card game in China that it was thought that this might be based on, but this is really, it's very just supposition. There's nothing to back it up. It's just an idea someone had. The first tarot deck that we have record of was created for Duke Filippo Maria Visconti of Milan, who was not a nice person, sometime before 1425. This was right around the same time that the newer styles of suits that I discussed in the minor arcana video were gaining popularity in France and Germany, but the older style decks were still popular in Italy. So the trump cards of the major arcana have always been paired with the cups, coins, rods, and swords of the minor arcana from their basis in Italy, from the very beginning. The first deck that we know of with this trump suit was created by the astrologer Maurizio da Tortone, and the art was created by Michelino da Bezazzo, and I cannot pronounce Italian, so I am murdering these people's names, and I apologize to their descendants. So while an astrologer did design these cards, there's no evidence that they had any deeper esoteric meaning or that they were used as anything other than playing cards at this time. 1425 is just a smidge too early for the birth of Renaissance Hermeticism that really brought a lot of the older teachings back into Europe after being lost during the Dark Ages and kept alive in the Islamic world. That's usually pegged to start around 1460, so we're a few decades too soon for that. However, an astrologer like de Torton probably, he probably had access to a lot of whatever magical writings existed. He probably had access to them. He was a paid astrologer, he worked for a high-level court, he probably did have access to some of these. So whether or not they were planning to use them for esoteric means, they did have some grounding in that for the symbolism and the iconography being used. And it's interesting to note that the Visconti family had documented history with heretical groups, including a previous Duke of Milan in 1322 being charged with necromancy. So this family that developed this new card game with these new trump suits, they did have an interesting history with esoteric subjects. There's no evidence that they were used for divination at this time. There's no evidence that they were anything but a card game, but it is interesting that there's this background there, that there's this interest. So I think that when people later on started making these connections, they weren't coming out of nowhere. Unfortunately, this first deck no longer exists. However, the guidebook does, and is currently held at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And so, 600 years of tarot card deck and book sets going together, and you always lose the cards first, right? And the book stays on your shelf, and then you can't use the deck anymore. So there's a long history of this as well. But so since we have the guidebook, we know something about the cards. We know kind of what they look like, we knew how they were used, and we know that there were not 22 cards in this deck. There were 16 cards in this deck, 4 for each of the minor suits. And this game specifically was called Virtues and Temptations. And as I said, there was no specifically esoteric meaning behind it, but all of the images were specifically allegorical. They were meant to evoke some sort of virtues and temptations. That's what the game was. So either good or bad imagery. By the 1440s, decks with the standard 22 trumps were more popular, especially in Milan. Examples of these decks do survive, a few cards each, and are held in several different museums. All surviving cards of this period are thought to come from the studio of the artist Bonifacio Bembo. Again, my Italian is terrible. All of these decks were probably commissioned by Duke Visconti, just like that earlier deck. Visconti died in 1447, but that didn't stop Milan's importance for this new type of card game. In 1450, Francesco Sforza became the Duke of Milan, and he also loved these cards. The most complete deck we have from the 1400s comes from the Sforza era, and modern reproductions of these cards, which sometimes take cards from different ones of these decks, they're generally called Visconti Sforza type decks. So if you find a modern reproduction, there's differences because they come from different decks, that they're kind of mashed together sometimes, and some cards just don't exist. So a modern artist has recreated in the style. So that's where that type of tarot deck, which is still quite popular with a lot of readers. In the 1500s, Ercole d'Este I, and I'm going to stop apologizing for my Italian because it's just going to keep happening. So who was the Duke of Ferrara. He commissioned a number of tarot decks, but these have very different symbolism and artwork than the Milan styles that Visconti and Sforza had preferred. These didn't really seem to go where. They never caught on in a popular way. Other people didn't reproduce them, and it's very hard to get reproductions of any of these cards, even though some of them do exist today. These early Italian tarot cards didn't have the text or numbers on them that we associate today. So other than a few guidebooks that exist, we don't know necessarily what the cards were called, if they have the similar names to what we do now. And we don't know what order that they went in, if they even had an established order. We don't know that because they just didn't write the numbers on the cards. But the images drew heavily from fairy tales and folk tales and allegorical stories and Bible stories And they were images that people were expected to recognize and understand without text saying what the card was. I know that stories and theories about tarot having this, like, hidden secret from the ancient past that had been passed down in this coded way. I know these stories are very popular. They make tarot seem very cool and mysterious. But these early images are very simple. There's a person doing one thing. There's not a lot of hidden anything in these images when you look at them. And they're not meant to hide things. It's kind of the exact opposite. They're meant for people who do not know how to read or write. Communicating with images was the way that people communicated. So these were meant that anyone could see this and know exactly what it was. Tarot cards now have a lot of symbolism added to them. They have a lot of coded meanings, but those have been added as we go through the ages, and we'll talk about that more in the third video about the changes made for divinatory purposes, but these early cards were very straightforward. The only complete surviving deck from the 1400s that we know of is the Solabusca deck, also from Ferrara. And this deck is notable not just for being complete, but for being the first one that has fully illustrated pip cards. You recognize this Three of Swords? We still use it in most tarot decks today. And in fact, this tarot deck is held at the British Museum, and Pamela Coleman Smith was able to reference this deck and do research with this deck while she was creating the first images for her deck that with A.E. Waite that she created. Although most of the cards that have been preserved from this era are luxurious, hand-painted, often gilded with actual gold luxury items, we do know that some cheaper woodcut versions exist. Some few examples have been preserved because they were misprinted and recycled as book bindings and have since been found when people had to recover old books. But I do want to stress that while these woodcut decks were less expensive than the hand-painted ones, they were still not cheap. Mass printing did not exist yet in Europe. Paper money wouldn't even be in use for another 200 years in Europe. So these cards, even the less expensive ones, were really only available for the merchant and noble classes in the Renaissance period. The cheap decks were, equivalent of getting an indie deck on Kickstarter that costs $100 or more for a single deck because they're short runs. And it was the same thing then, that they were still pricey. It was also around this time that the term tarot was first used. First in about 1500 in Ferrara as tarocchi in Italian, and then in 1505 in Milan as tarot, the French version. Which is why we do not pronounce the T in tarot in English. C'est français. Although the British tendency to deliberately mispronounce French words makes me a little bit surprised that the British don't pronounce it as tarot. And for all of you who do use that pronunciation, sorry, you're wrong. It's tarot. It's French. It's a French word. In English, we don't pronounce the T. Sorry. Cards have been preserved in a lot of odd ways, not just book bindings. In the early 1900s, there was renovations going on of a well at Sforza Castle in Milan, and tarot cards were found. But these had images that were not just like the Italian cards that had already been seen. Some had images that we've never seen other decks with this type of iconography, and some of the images were much more similar to the French Tarot de Marseilles than the Italian versions. And up until these cards were found, 100 years ago, it was really thought that the Visconti Sforza decks and the Tarot de Marseilles had been these two paths that had been happening simultaneously and separately. But as more cards have been discovered, it now seems that the Visconti Sforza Italian decks directly influenced the Tarot de Marseille style, and it wasn't two things happening at once, but it was really one line going from one to the other. Speaking of France, the Tarot de Marseille that I mentioned, designed by Jean Noblet in 1650, became by far the most popular style of tarot deck at the time, but it was not the only or even the first type of French deck. Examples of other earlier decks in France include the Caitlin Joffrey deck from 1557 and the Parisian from around 1600. And these cards also contain a variety of different imagery, some Italian, some French, and some that were kind of dead ends in tarot, and we haven't seen any reproductions since then. The French decks were the first to have text and numbers on them, so we know both what they were called at the time and the order that they were expected to be in the deck. As I mentioned, the Tarot de Marseilles style quickly became the standard type of tarot deck in Europe after it was designed in 1650 by Noblet. Or possibly earlier than 1650. That's the first documented example, but it's very likely that other versions of this deck existed before, and that Noblet was simply updating earlier styles the way that the cards had passed from Italy into France, and the changes were very incremental. Interestingly, this deck was not created in Marseille. It was created in Paris. And other decks of the time, including Pierre Medeni's deck in 1709, were created in Dijon. But in 1736, Chausson of Marseille published what would be the true prototype of this deck style, giving them the name that we know them even today by. Then in 1760, Nicolas Convert, also of Marseille, copied these designs into woodblock prints, mass-produced them, and they became very popular. If you buy a modern Tarot de Marseille deck, it is most likely based on these designs. The Marseille-style decks were so popular that they were imported back into Italy, completely supplanted the original Visconti Sforza type decks, and gradually became the modern Milanese, Lombardy, and Piedmontese style decks. But there was another deck gaining popularity at this time that threatened to completely erase tarot from Europe, and that was the German Tarot deck. The Tarot deck kept the same basic format, except for with the suits, they went with the modern German or French style suits, so getting rid of the cups, swords, wands, and coins. And they also, for the 22 majors, got rid of all of the standard names and the standard iconography and just used decorative scenes. And so the artists could really do anything they wanted with these decks. And with this creative freedom and getting away from this, more preachy religious iconography of the tarot style, they were much more popular for gaming. People really liked this kind of free and open style of the Tarot decks. And so for actual gaming purposes for tarot, these decks pretty much took over everywhere but Italy by the late 1700s. But despite all of this, tarot didn't go away. With its original purpose of gaming fading away, it found another use. People began looking at the allegorical imagery on these cards and using them for divination. They use them to answer questions. They use them to predict the future and to tell stories of the past. They really looked into the imagery of these cards and found spiritual meaning beyond the game purpose. This pivot would radically change both how tarot was seen in popular culture, but also the designs of the cards themselves. So this spiritual meaning, this divinatory purpose, really added a lot of detail to the cards and added a lot of meaning to the cards that hadn't really been there in the past. I'll be covering the cards used for divination in the 3rd episode of this series, so make sure you subscribe and ring that bell to get notified of that, because the cards did change so much after this change in purpose happened, and it's a really interesting story. Lots of Western occultists to go through and their life stories. So I hope to see you back for that. And I hope you are enjoying this deep dive into tarot with me. I've had a lot of fun, and I hope you have too. See you later. Thank you so much for watching.